For those who haven't watched my first video series, which was called Chapter 1, Why Do We Have to Work? I'm just going to give some quick background information. The videos on this channel will be a chapter-by-chapter discussion of my book, Hunting, Gathering, and Video Games, which looks like this. And the Why Do We Have to Work series gave a historical overview on why the human race has always had to work. And I traced the common link between the workday of the hunter-gatherer, the first millennium BC farmer, the first century AD pottery-maker, the 19th century assembly line worker, and today's video game programmer. And in that video series, and I'll be doing the same in this series, I look at human history using the terminology from Alvin Toffler's book, The Third Wave. And the first wave is that transition from hunting and gathering to agriculture. The second wave is the transition from agriculture to the Industrial Revolution. And the third wave begins with the computer age, or the age of information. All right, on with Chapter 2, which discusses why in a complex society bartering doesn't work and we have to use money. All right, now back in the hunting-gathering days, there was no need for money. People hunted and gathered their own food, they created their own clothing, they built some kind of shelter. There was no abundance of goods and services in those days, or really anything that we could call goods and services. So the whole idea of money would have just made no sense at all. Now when we get to the early years of agriculture, which started sometime around 8000 BC, that's when people began to specialize. Some people just worked on food or just produced food, others maybe just worked on clothes, others just on shelter, others in other areas such as tool making. Now when this first started and there were specialists in only a few areas, there's probably still no need for money, and people could just trade directly with one another. The farmer could trade grain for tools, the tool maker could trade tools for clothing, and so on. But now as people got better and better at agriculture, it meant less and less people were needed to produce the community's food. So this in turn meant more and more people were free to specialize and develop specialized skills. And the more specialized skills meant the more goods and services. And once you have lots of goods and services, the whole bartering process gets very complicated. Now as an example, let's look to ancient Egypt. Now as far back as 2500 BC or so, it already had cities, and these cities were full of specialists. And specialist occupations included not only farmers and tailors and architects, but also things like bakers and soldiers, pottery sculptors, scribes, as people who could read and write, and people who made the ancient Egyptian equivalent of paper, which they made from the papyrus plant. They had to cut the papyrus stem in a certain way and flatten it and dry it and polish it. Now suppose an ancient Egyptian architect needed some writing paper. Now there might be a papyrus processor next door, but suppose that papyrus processor just didn't need any writing paper. If so, the two would not be able to barter with each other. Now suppose what that papyrus processor really wanted was a basket of olives from his olive grower neighbor. But when he approaches his neighbor, the olive grower says, "Sorry, I just don't need paper." So the same problem. Both parties have something to offer, but one of the parties is not interested in what the other one has. Now suppose what that olive grower really needed was an architect. But when he went to the architect said, "Sorry, I just don't like olives." So this shows one of the drawbacks of a system based on barter. You can't trade with someone who doesn't want what you've got. And economists call this the double coincidence of wants problem. That an economic system run on bartering means you have to spend lots of time and energy finding parties whose needs are complementary with your own. Now one way to solve the double coincidence of wants problem involves working out a deal with a third party. So in case of the ancient Egyptian architect who wanted writing paper from the papyrus processor, who didn't need any architect services, they all might be able to work out a deal with using the olive grower as a third party, because the olive grower does need architect services. So the architect could say to the olive grower, "Okay, I'll do such and such for you if you give this amount of olives to the papyrus processor, and then he can pay you by giving me a certain amount of writing paper." But that does get very complicated, and it also takes lots of time and energy. So rather than work through a third or fourth or even fifth party, economists note that communities with lots of goods and services almost always end up solving their bartering problems by using the much easier solution of finding some sort of object that will serve as what's called a medium of exchange. And the word medium here is used in the sense of something that transmits, or an intermediate, like in the sentence, words are a medium of expression. So in the phrase medium of exchange, the word medium describes some sort of object that will serve as an intermediate for everyone in the community to use for trade. Now, the medium of exchange we use here in America, or modern America, happens mainly to be dollar bills and electronic accounts. But these are just modern versions of things like shells or beads or bags of salt or precious metal like gold and silver. They all serve the same purpose. All right, more in part 2.